Osho. May the sacred presence of him who said he would abide in his teaching be our guide. May we follow his glorious example and tread with unfaltering step this noble path until we too shall attain enlightenment. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha Prajna Paramita. So good evening again. My topic for tonight is practicing with the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, of suffering. And this is a follow-up to last week's discussion that we started on Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching. So before I dive in, can you hear me okay? Give me like a thumbs up, okay. I have new headsets. I've been playing with the setup, so, and it's interesting, I'm still adjusting to seeing all of you in little squares. And not being able to sense the energy in the room. So I'm just kind of looking at all of you, trying to back that out of you. So, so it's a learning curve. So thank you for being here. And I'm amazed at the power of community and Sangha in pretty strange circumstances. And adapting this like ancient form, I kind of think of what would the medieval monks have thought about this whole setup, you know? They could never have imagined this. So here we are, carrying on the tradition. So thank you for being here. And so tonight's topic is about one of the very foundational key teachings, and we're going to be making our way through Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching, and I think it's lovely that we're going to revisit some of these core foundational teachings, because what our practice is again and again and again is to come back to these key teachings and look at our lives and how do they apply to our lives now? How do we work with this teaching now? And that really came home to me this week as I was diving into this topic of how it continues to seem fresh to me, continues to seem like, oh, what is the nature of this now? How does this manifest in my life now? How do I apply it now? So I'm going to start out with a quote from that first chapter that we read last week that captures part of the, but it was one of the key passages. So he said, for 45 years, the Buddha said over and over again, I teach only suffering and the transformation of suffering. When we recognize and acknowledge our own suffering, the Buddha, which means the Buddha in us, will look at it, discover what brought it about, and prescribe a course of action that can transform it into peace, joy, and liberation. Suffering is the means the Buddha used to liberate himself, and it is also the means by which we become free. So I wanted to dive deeper into this word that here is translated as suffering, dukkha, because it is so key, and there's a lot of misunderstanding around this. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about this. Some of you have heard this before, but as I said at the beginning, I think there's just a real usefulness in coming back again and again to these core teachings. So the questions that I would ask you to consider holding in mind tonight as you hear the talk and consider this topic of dukkha, of suffering, is what does it mean to come into relationship with your own suffering and the suffering of the world? So what is it to come into relationship with this? And how is it possible to use our suffering as a gateway to transformation? How do we use suffering to transform? And for those of you who've worked with this teaching for a while, I'm hoping that you'll share during the comment part about how that's worked for you, how it's operated in your life. So those are my two main purposes. How do we come into relationship with it, and how do we as it transform? So, yeah, one of my thoughts around this is that just the other thing that I ask you to do is, if you're feeling like, because we're in really extreme, unusual circumstances, we're getting, bombarded with really dire news every day, and we all are experiencing loss at some level. My hope is that actually thinking about, how do we work with this circumstance now, and how do we transform it? How do we learn from it? How do we work with it? How do we learn to be with this circumstance, this life as it is, in non-opposition? Hopefully that will inspire you to turn towards. So that's my hope, not to add to suffering. I have a talk on suffering, for Pete's sakes. So I'm hoping it will inspire. I'll just share a little sidebar. It was interesting today, knowing that I was giving this talk on suffering, that I had one of the most stressful days at work that I've had in quite some time. And I just had, was thinking, oh man, this is just not good. I'm going to be all wound up for tonight and stressed and suffering, right? So it was really helpful to actually have this teaching really firmly in mind, because I've been preparing for the talk, and to think of, how am I suffering now? What is the nature of my suffering right now? And so what I noticed, it was, at first there was this kind of, the surface of the talk was, oh my gosh, I have too much to do, I'm overwhelmed. And then when I thought, oh, why is that suffering, right? And so then underneath it was fear. Oh, I'm gonna look incompetent, I'm gonna look unprepared. Oh, what's underneath that? Oh, it's attacking my sense of self. And so, oh, I can let go of that. I can let go of that. So anyway, it just gives you kind of a little bit of a preview of how sometimes just being able to acknowledge, to name it, then we can work with it more skillfully, rather than being jerked around by it, rather than being yanked around and slip into reactive patterns. So diving into some of the teachings and some of the definitions, and I just want to give, this part is kind of the information part of things, giving you some background on this. For those, I know many of you are familiar with these, and but some of you it may be newer for. So some context. After the Buddha's enlightenment, his first teachings were of the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, very simply stated, one way of phrasing them, this is from the sutra itself. O bhikkhus, there are four noble truths. They are the noble truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the cessation of suffering. So that's from the sutra. Another more simply stated way of putting that is first, suffering exists. Again, the word suffering is a translation of the Sanskrit word, Pali word, dukkha. And we're going to talk more about dukkha and how challenging that is to translate, and how it encompasses a wide range of types of suffering. But others of the Four Noble Truths, just to finish that out, so suffering exists. Suffering is caused by clinging. That's a classic way of translating that, sometimes also called grasping or thirst. The third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering. That's the hopeful part of this. And that the fourth noble truth, the end to suffering, that the prescription for the end to suffering is path, the path of practice. So it's also helpful to know that the Buddha's, at the time that the Buddha lived and before that, the frame of thinking at the time was that we were on these endless cycles of death and rebirth, and that there was no escape from that. And the Buddha taught that there was a way to step off that and those endless cycles of samsara. So, so now some words about dukkha. This word itself, as I said before, it's sometimes difficult to translate, and there's a lot that's captured in it. It's often translated, as I said, as suffering, but it also encompasses several different kinds of suffering. So physical, emotional, psychological suffering are all examples of that. And also suffering that comes from the knowledge that death is inevitable. So all of these things can be included in that, but the root causes are suffering as a result of our responses to these things, to physical, emotional, and physical suffering. It's our response to those that causes the suffering. It's also sometimes translated as I always stumble over this, dissatisfactoriness, dissatisfaction. And this captures this quality of suffering that is something more subtle, that things just aren't quite right, no matter what's going on, just not quite right. It's also expressed traditionally as a wheel out of kilter, which I think really paints a great description. If you think of like in the Buddha's time, a cart with a wheel, and the wheel's not quite right, not quite lined up. The cart functions, it does what it's supposed to do. It's literally rolling along, but it's not doing it quite right, not quite exactly right. And I'm going to read a little passage about that from this book. You can see it probably not, it kind of does funny things on my screen. Buddhism Plain and Simple by Steve Hagen. If you haven't heard of that one, it's a very nice, clear read about some of the foundational teachings. And this is how he describes it. One moment here. So he says, dukkha actually comes from a Sanskrit word that refers to a wheel out of kilter. If we think of a wheel as one that performs some important function, such as a potter's wheel, then the out of true wheel creates constant hardship for us every time we try to make a clay vessel. In the Buddhist time, the accompanying image may have been a cart with an out of true wheel being pulled along. You can imagine how comfortable it must feel to ride in such a vehicle, how uncomfortable it must feel to ride in such a vehicle. The repeated wobble, rise, and drop starts out as annoying, then becomes steadily more distracting and disturbing. Maybe there's a little pleasure in it for the rider at first, a little bounce perhaps, but after a while it becomes more and more vexing. The first truth of the Buddha Dharma likens human life to this out-of-kilter wheel. Something basic and important isn't right. It bothers us, makes us unhappy time after time. With each turn of the wheel, each passing day, we experience pain. So that's just a little elaboration of that. And I also wanted to share a passage that comes from a recent article that some of you may have seen from the Lion's Roar, and it's entitled something like 9 Buddhist Teachers Explain Suffering. I don't know if any of you saw that, and they all offer just very short passages, which is quite lovely. And I'm just going to share a couple of them because I think it really illuminates this nicely. One is from Sharon Salzberg, and here's what she has to say. There are times in our lives when we wish we could change the ending of the story. Sometimes we lose what we care about. We are separated from those we love. Our bodies fall apart as we get older. We feel helpless or hurt, or our lives just seem to be slipping away. These are all aspects of dukkha, one of the principal teachings of the Buddha. Dukkha means suffering, discontent, unsatisfactoriness, hollowness, change. The Buddha said, all I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. Suffering in his teaching does not necessarily mean grave physical pain, but rather the mental suffering we undergo when our tendency to hold on to pleasure encounters the fleeting nature of life. and our experiences become unsatisfying and ungovernable. I think that captures a lot in there. And one last little bit, and then I want to kind of open things up to discussion and a little tiny experiment. There's a lot written about suffering and the nature of suffering and all the various ways that we suffer. And I think it can just help get into the kind of the range of it, the magnitude of it. Like I think we're all familiar with sort of overt kind of suffering, but some of this subtlety of just not quite right can be super helpful to tune into. So some other descriptions of this. This comes from Edward Conz's description from Buddhism, a book called Buddhism, Its Essence and Development. So he lists a few things. Gaining pleasure at the cost of someone else can cause suffering. This can be, another one is enjoying something, getting something, but then being immediately afraid that you're going to lose it. So it's tainted by this, the impermanence of it. And the last one is really the key to this, part of it anyway. Anything pleasant that is based on something that the world has to offer because things change. So trying to find our pleasure, our comfort, our happiness on externals, because externals are another word that I heard used to translate this is unreliable. So things that are unreliable. So I wanted to do a little exercise. So what I thought we'd do is just sit in meditation for about 1 minute and notice, and then I'm going to ask you for some feedback. So kind of put yourselves in a comfortable position, and we'll just sit for like 1 minute to kind of get you a flavor of this. So I'll just do a little ting and a little ting to begin and a little ting to end. I don't know if you can hear my bell. It might be a little too close to my microphone. So I'm going to ask one of the hosts to unmute us. And what I'm interested in is if you notice where your mind went during just that 1 minute of meditation. And sometimes this can help us kind of, if you notice, like you're thinking, when's she going to be done? Or I'm hungry, or this is wonderful, or anything that you noticed at all, or if you just completely just relaxed into the moment. I'm just curious if anybody's willing to share.
Okay, I paid attention to what was comfortable or uncomfortable about my body. That's where my mind went.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's what I did too. I also kind of had a bad day today, Shintai, at work. And so I kind of just used the opportunity to sort of feel this, the tension of the day in my body and where it felt, you know, where I felt the tension, I guess.
Anybody else want to share anything?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about losing something that I love and how that's going to be really painful. I was thinking about my dog who came wandering in here. He's 15, and he brings me joy every day, and I know he's not going to live forever. And I just try and enjoy him as much as I can, but it's going to hurt when he goes.
Yeah. Well, so part of why I do this is one of the things that we can check in with ourselves throughout the day is how much of our thoughts leap forward to some kind of evaluation or judgment of like, I wish it was a little more like this, or I wish I didn't have that, or all these kind of little adjustments, and how we work with that, because it's not necessarily going to create suffering, but sometimes it does, depending on how we react to those thoughts of this isn't quite right. So there's a way to be with those thoughts that don't necessarily create suffering, but I think it's helpful to be able to know the contents of our own minds and kind of where we gravitate towards. And so that little 1 minute's kind of meant to illustrate the first noble truth that suffering exists. This sense of dissatisfaction kind of arises pretty naturally and pretty quickly at times of like, I wish I would have gotten a cup of tea during the break, or all of those kind of small and large things that come up. So the next part of this, and I see that it's already 8 o'clock. So I'd like to talk some about how we transform our suffering, or how do we work towards recognizing our own particular forms of suffering and work with our relationship to it. So I'm going to pause for just a moment, and for those of you who've worked with this, have worked with karma, or how dukkha shows up for you, just going to spend just a moment pausing, and then I would love for this to be an opportunity for people to share what that's looked like for them. If you can volunteer anything, I have some things that I can share too, but I really would be interested to hear how other people have worked with this first noble truth and how that's helped their practice, like what that's been like to change that relationship or examine that relationship or work with it. So I'm going to again give us like a minute to sort of think about that, and then invite people to share. So I'm just gonna, I guess I'll do like 1 minute of zazen to kind of reflect on that question. Does that question seem clear now? Okay, all right. So do any thoughts come to mind for those of you that have been working with this?
Well, I will say, as a recovering alcoholic, that what they call hitting bottom, in AA is for me all about suffering and the transformation of suffering, and it doesn't have to be, doesn't have to look like suffering from the outside. But I would have had no motivation to change my life at all if everything had been going perfectly fine.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts that I wanted to be sure include, and that was one of them is that it said that there's just the right amount of suffering in this human form to motivate us to practice, or sometimes we just need the right amount to motivate us. Things are going well, we're not super motivated because things are great, and if we're really deep down in it, it's really sometimes can be really hard to motivate ourselves or to be mobilized or to be able to. So to having just the right amount that will spur us into practice, and we'll be in that place where we can actually act on it.
Yeah, and I guess I imagine that the degree of transformation is related to the amount of suffering that a person is experiencing. I mean, for me, it was well, not a matter of even motivating myself. It was just kind of change or die. It was pretty much like having a gun pointed at my head, basically, you know. And it was a huge transformation for me. But I think it could be a smaller transformation in other ways, you know, for other kinds of suffering.
I definitely agree with what you said, what you're saying, Emily, about the degree of suffering, because that's definitely what happened to me, that the transformation was immense just because the suffering was immense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree as well. You know, I'm also a recovering alcoholic, and I mean, when I first got sober, I cried all the time because I had so much suffering, I guess, you know. I mean, I didn't even know it until I got sober, and then I was miserable, and then slowly the transformation started taking place, and now, you know, I mean, sure, I have periods of time that I'm not so happy, but mostly I'm so grateful that my life has changed so much, and you know, that you know, I don't feel like I'm suffering. I get discontent, and I suppose that's like unsatisfactoriness, you know. You know, I get worried about stuff. I have trouble sleeping when I'm worried about stuff, but then I can kind of turn it over and look at the positive, and things are okay. And you know, and I was thinking when I meditated the first minute we meditated, you know, I'm really sorry I'm late, but I happened to be in the woods hunting for mushrooms, and you know, it was fabulous. I felt like, you know, and I kept thinking about, you know, I could be sitting and meditating, but instead I'm meditating on mushrooms, and you know, but that if I'm having a hard time, I can always find something that's wonderful, and it might just be going outside and looking at the sky. But you know, I mean, it was a huge transformation, like Emily says, you know, and it doesn't mean the little day-to-day stuff doesn't happen, but it's not huge.
After having the huge transformation, the little day-to-day stuff seems much easier to deal with in comparison.
And one of the things that I wanted to share about, for me in my practice, like just specifically working with the way this is, it's stated as like suffering exists, suffering is in the First Noble Truth. It helped me kind of change my relationship to the ways that I experience suffering, because for me, a lot of times my internal dialogue would be this quality of self-blaming. Like if I just do it right, if I just arrange my life right, if I just do this or that, or change or move or different relationship or something, somehow if I somehow line it all up right, I'm not going to have this feeling of dissatisfaction, or somehow I'm going to be able to line it all up and it's going to all work out. And to recognize that in this human form, you're going to experience this feeling of dissatisfaction, and it's not my fault. It's just part of being human. It's part of the whole mess of being human. And when I can relax around that, has really helped me a lot, just to find a lot of acceptance for myself and acceptance for other people, because this is our situation as human beings. This is how we're going to have this in life. And if we can, to me, it just kind of helps me relax into, oh, okay, I can dance with that.
Well, that dovetails pretty well with my experience in early and continuing sobriety as well. That you know, it really, there's a million ways to anesthetize oneself against the small and large sufferings that we experience every day. It's really easy to do. And sometimes it's fine to do, but a lot of being sober for me has been about, yeah, so that itches. I don't have to scratch it. It's just how it is, you know. Okay, that's a little bit painful. It's not the end of the world. And just, as you said, acceptance of impermanence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So maybe suffering is impermanent too. That's a nice idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. It's all changing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm pretty sure I've been told repeatedly in Sanzen that if I'm having a terrible day, that's good news. if I'm having a great day, look out. It's gonna change.
Yeah, that's a good point, because yeah, usually you can really, if you're having a bad day, it can only get better, right? Like, so.
And in a way, this is this topic and kind of phrasing that question is a little bit of a teaser for coming attractions in teachings, because we're going to go into the cessation of suffering and the path of practice as a way of transforming a relationship to this. So it's kind of just I kind of threw open a really wide question, because it's really kind of our lifelong question of how is it that we come in relationship to this particular bundle of conditioning that we have to work with right here and right now in this form. And it's a really super big question. It's really all about how is it that we practice and move through and find freedom and liberation and wisdom and compassion within our circumstances. And the hope and the reality of practice is that it is actually possible. It's absolutely possible to change our relationship to what seems can seem very sticky and difficult, and it is possible to change that. So we're going to be getting more into that, especially through Thich Nhat Hanh's. This very first section of the book is all about the Four Noble Truths. So I'm hoping this will kind of encourage you to dive into the book and stick with the discussions on this, because there's so much. I mean, this is like the whole thing. The whole thing. How do we understand our own suffering? How do we understand our conditioning? And how can we find this way that we can rest in acceptance in it and move with clarity and wisdom and compassion and meet it all with that heart. So I just want to kind of close out this part, although I guess we're just ending kind of the discussion, but I just want to return back to that quote that I read at the beginning from Thich Nhat Hanh's book. I teach only suffering and the transformation of suffering. When we recognize and acknowledge our own suffering, the Buddha, which means the Buddha in us, will look at it, discover what brought it about, and prescribe a course of action that can transform it into peace, joy, and liberation. Suffering is the means the Buddha used to liberate himself, and it is also the means by which we can become free. So that's the promise and the truth of practice that we can validate through our own experience in our own lives. So I see like we have 2 minutes. So we weaved in a little bit of a conversation, but if there's any other comments or questions before we end our evening together.
I have a comment. I don't know whether it's been stated before or not, but at this point, it's not the suffering, it's my reaction to the suffering. That's the whole practice to me. And the joy or the ability that following my breath has to determining my reaction. If I can begin to breathe and be conscious of my breathing instead of reacting, I've been successful.
Thanks for sharing that. That's spot on. There's kind of a slogan that says like pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. That kind of is summed up in that. It's really exactly right. It's our reactions to it. But thanks for saying it so well and so clearly. Any other thoughts before I see on my clock anyway, it's 8:15.
I have one. This was originally my pinned tweet on Twitter before I moved on to other things. An insight I came up with way beginning of my transformation. Allow yourself to want goodness. You still have to suffer, but you don't have to want to.
Thank you for that. Any final thoughts before I say the closing verse?
Please remember to mute yourself for the closing verse and just let Shintai recite it alone.
I feel like we're starting to invent a new form where there's sort of this train wreck at the end of. So thank you for that reminder. Abiding in this ephemeral world like a lotus in muddy water, the mind is pure and goes beyond, thus without a Buddha. All Buddhas
throughout
space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha Prajna Paramita. There's kind of this quick mute, unmute action at the end. So you can unmute everybody so we can all say goodbye. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
It was really good.
Bye.
Time to throw the sabutons down the stairs.
That's right.
Yeah, think of all the exercise we're missing.
I know.
Up and down.
And,
Did you see the Bodhisattva